So, Richard Schneider began his career as a veterinarian in Saskatchewan, but quickly transitioned to wildlife research, obtaining a PhD from the University of Guelph. Richard's main interest has been conservation biology, working at the interface between science and policy. Early on, he worked for CPAWS and then as an ecological consultant, and finally as a senior scientist at the Integrated Landscape Management Lab at the University of Alberta. He has authored 2 books on biodiversity conservation and numerous scientific articles with over 1,200 citations. Richard served as the executive director of Nature Alberta from early 2020 until his retirement last fall. He continues to serve as the editor-in-chief of Nature Alberta magazine. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Steph, and thank you everybody who's taking time out of your evening to learn a little bit about campaigning. I know there's quite a diverse group here, so I'm hoping that what I'll say will be of use to all of you. Like I say, it's a little bit more challenging when it's a diverse audience. Just before we get started, I want to say this is about environmental advocacy, but that's a very, very broad subject. There's so many different issues, different scales, and I'm going to be talking here about biodiversity and land, though, whatever your issue is, it really, most of the same principles apply, even though there is a lot of variety. The same basic principles towards success will be applicable. The one thing I am going to focus on is groups rather than what an individual can do, because we're talking here today mainly about campaigns and how they're structured and how they're run and so on, and this really implies a group. So with that, I will get started. I wanted to say first that sometimes it's kind of tempting to think of environmental advocacy as raising awareness and conveying scientific facts. In other words, that's where the problem lies. If only people understood what was wrong, things would surely change. I think that that's certainly part of the puzzle, but there's more to it. And I want to suggest that you should, instead of thinking of just it's all just about awareness, think about it as talking about dividing a pie. We're dealing with a finite land base, or whatever resource you're interested in. They're finite. We're not growing more land. So the question is, how are we going to allocate that finite resource? And the reality is, in most cases, we're trying to take more than the land can actually give. So there usually is an underlying conflict that is if you dig deeper, you'll see there's some kind of a conflict that's driving this between competing social issues. So really what you should think about is that conservation, it's really a form of decision making. It's a social process. There are other people with different objectives, different priorities, and somehow we have to work together to figure out what to do. And that's the context you as an environmental advocate work within. So with that background, I'm going to tackle 2 main questions in this talk. First, I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at how land use decisions are made. If conservation is decision making, we better understand how these decisions are made. Next, then we flip over into the campaign side, the question is, how do we as advocates influence that process and achieve real meaningful change on the ground? I added this caveat here that I'm going to be talking mostly about public lands. Fortunately, most of Canada the land is still in the public domain. The rules are a lot different on private land, especially here in Alberta. Private land is sacrosanct. So the general principles apply, but I'm going to be using all my examples, and certainly all my experience has been on public lands. So the state of the art in terms of decision making is referred to as structured decision making or evidence-based decision making. It's comprised of several steps. I show them here as a cycle. I'll just quickly run through them. We won't spend a lot of time on this, though. The first step is to frame the decision, like bound it. What is this issue about? What's the scope? What's the spatial scope? Who's involved? And how's the decision going to be made? So that's what framing means. We just got to get a basic handle on what we're talking about here. Then when we get into the actual decision-making process, the first step is to define the objectives. It's like I said, this is a group of stakeholders, representatives of stakeholders. So you can imagine sitting around a table, and each one has a different objective, and those have to be defined very clearly so we all know what we all want before we can start looking at options. Next, the step is to develop alternatives. What options are there in terms of managing land? What could we do? What could we do different? So there's a brainstorming piece of this to say, what options do we have available? Then the next step is to estimate the consequences for each one of those management options. So you think of, let's do the status quo, let's try new approach B and C and so on. What are the outcomes under each one? Can we predict what's going to happen under each one of those alternatives? You're building up here a body of evidence. So the next stage here, evaluate trade-offs, is to then weigh the outcomes under these different management objectives and make that final choice. Which one are we going to go with? We can't do them all. We have to make a choice. There are trade-offs involved. Now, at least, this is where the word evidence-based decision-making comes from, because we have gone through that process of defining what the objectives are and seeing how different management alternatives work in terms of achieving those objectives. And then we have to make a decision. The final step here is to implement whatever decision you made and monitor, and usually you end up over time revisiting, things change, and tweaking your decisions, whatever they are. I want to point out that science is a key part of this puzzle, but it's not everywhere. Its focus is mainly on developing alternatives. We often look for experts to think out of the box and figure out new ways to do it. Not exclusive, but that's often a role that science plays. A key role is to estimate consequences. Like we're talking about predicting the future here. So we're having an expert opinion on, if we do this, what's going to happen over time. So really draw on scientific process to get unbiased, as much as possible, objective answers to that. But important to note, science doesn't make decisions. It informs decisions. It doesn't make them. Ultimately, it's people are going to decide. If nobody cares about sage grouse, we're going to let them go, regardless if the science tells you they're going to, be extirpated in 10 years if we don't change. Science can only tell you what's going to happen. People have to make the decision and, decide how they're going to react. So structured decision-making has been used. It's used extensively, but mostly for well-defined problems with limited scope. So one example is that here in Alberta has been it was used to set withdrawal limits on water in the Athabasca River by oil sands companies that withdraw water for their use. So the process of figuring out how much water under what conditions was done through a structured decision-making process with a number of stakeholders at the table, experts doing the modeling to predict. All that stuff was done. Another place where we see a form of structured decision-making, and I've kind of given you the framework. What it looks like in practice varies a lot from application to application. But a form of it is used all the time in cities. In Calgary, Edmonton, we plan our cities very carefully, right? We don't put oil refineries next to schools and so on. There's a plan, and it defines what happens where. So it is used a lot. Where it has struggled is at larger scales. When you get, a larger spatial scale, it hasn't worked very well. So I'm going to get into that in a sec. I just come back to this just to say, if you, as an advocate, find yourself or your issue is being handled by a structured process, and what's your role there? You are then a stakeholder. You're going to be one of the several stakeholders around the table. You're going to make sure that when they're framing the decision, that important environmental processes are included. You're going to help define objectives. You'll probably know more than most everyone else at the table about what the environmental issues are and what the specific outcomes that are important. You may have some ideas about different alternatives for how we might do things differently, and certainly have a role in the discussions around trade-offs. So when I leave this behind, if you're interested, there's a whole chapter in my book. I'll have a link at the end that talks completely about structured decision making, how it works, and the role of conservationists in that process. But for the rest of the talk today, I'm going to focus more on the campaign side. And I should say it actually they do relate. They're not totally distinct, because you might ask yourself a question like, how did this structured decision making process arise? It just doesn't magically appear. It had to end up on the political agenda. It had to be high enough of an issue that somebody said, you know what, we're going to have to do something about it. Let's start a decision-making process. So the campaign sometimes has a front end where you drive the issue up in terms of its profile that leads to something like this at the back end. And then ultimately, this piece here where you're evaluating trade-offs, many of the same principles that I'm going to talk about in campaigning, they apply here. But let's carry on, finish off the decision-making part. When we get to broader scales, I'm going to use Alberta as an example, but it works the same way in other provinces. What we have is a series of administrative silos. The big ones are agriculture, forestry, and energy. There's departments for each one of these, and they each have their own mandate, and they operate in silos. That's why I'm using this analogy here. They don't necessarily talk to each other very much, which makes planning quite challenging, because they trip over each other and their mandates are sometimes competing. And when you get to environment, it's not even listed here. The wildlife managers and parks people, they're at the bottom of the totem pole, trying to get a word in edgewise here. Now, I want to draw your attention to a process that was intended to solve this. If you're not familiar with it, it's called the Alberta Land Use Framework. Other provinces have had some similar things. This took place over several years in the early 2000s, extensive public consultation, lots of technical work, lots of modeling work done. The idea was to get over this silo approach to managing the land. The land is the land. It's not multiple pieces of land. It's just a single entity. And so what we really need is a unified land manager, and that's what the land use framework tried to achieve. And the idea was then to develop regional plans that would address the issues that are prevalent in every given region of the province. One key thing was to put hard limits on cumulative impacts, because we have all these different players, oil and gas, forestry, and so on, all doing things on the same land base at the same time. And we're hitting and exceeding ecological limits. So the idea was to do unified planning that says, here's a cap that collectively we can't exceed. And it defined an authority for action that could work at that high level. Now, the unfortunate thing is, after it was released, political winds changed. The champion, Ed Stelmach, was premier. He retired, and the person who led this, Ted Morton, also retired, and political priorities changed, and it ran out of steam. Two regional plans were created, and it just died. It seems incredible after years of effort and a law. There's a law that underpins this all. People just walked away. So where do you go? This would have provided that venue for some form of stakeholder-based planning where the trade-offs are now analyzed and evidence is gathered. That was what this was all about, and it's not there. Unfortunately, it's not even that we have the status quo. Alberta's not an easy place right now to proceed in terms of environmental issues. Since the UCP took power, we do have the land use plannings on ice, but not only that, we're seeing a progressive unwinding of existing policies that previous conservative government, this isn't an issue of NDP versus conservative. The UCP is unwinding previous conservative government policies on the environment. And my impression is that they are serving a very narrow base rather than the broad public interest, which makes it a hard go when we are ultimately representing public interests ourselves as environmental advocates. So what you're left with It's a wrestling match. You and a whole bunch of stakeholders, are basically a free-for-all, and the referee is neither unbiased nor fair. It's not a fair process. You're here as the Lorax, and good luck to you. We're not the biggest, we're not the strongest, so what we need is good strategy and sound tactics, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Because even though it is daunting, if it seems daunting to you, it is. It's not easy. And again, not all the other provinces aren't wonderful either. In Ontario, Premier Ford just took a hard run at the green belt around Toronto and so on. This happens elsewhere. Um, we can succeed, and we have in recent, even since the UCP's come into government. One example is the parks, defending the parks and making sure none are lost, and the coal expansion. I'm going to give I'll run through a couple of examples. I forgot to mention that. I have a couple of case studies I'm quickly going to run through at the end. So it is possible. It's not easy. So let's start then on the campaign side of things. I just want to reiterate that advocacy is more than just expressing outrage. I mean, that's the natural impulse, just to get on a soapbox and yell, "This is wrong. This needs to change." What advocacy is about is achieving meaningful change on the ground. That was where the focus has to go. You want to change something, not just yell. So with that in mind, the first step is to know where you're going. An adage I really like is to begin with the end in mind. You're never going to achieve something unless you have good clarity around what it is exactly that you're trying to achieve. Once you know where you're headed, the next step is then to develop a sound strategic plan to get you there. And it's potentially going to have many steps. So we're going to run through those here in a moment. But the first thing you have to consider is even whether you should engage. It's not like a campaign is warranted over every issue. The fact is there's just too many issues for them all. The environmental community is small. There just aren't enough people to do all the work there is. So you have to ask yourself, well, first of all, how important is the issue? Does it warrant a significant expenditure of time and energy? A campaign, even a small one, takes, you'll see in a minute, these are not light undertakings. It requires a fair amount of effort. Is that warranted for the issue at hand? And lastly, what are the prospects of success? If you're facing a brick wall, maybe this isn't a good idea. And just to be clear, I'm not saying give up. My context here is you have individually and as groups a certain amount of energy that you have to expend on conservation or whatever your issue is. You want to allocate it in a way that has the most effect, most positive effect. So if you look at one issue and you decide, you know what, we can't move this, we're going to go over here because there's some prospect for moving forward there. I think that's a logical, important thing to do. The other piece here to think about is conflict versus effort. In this graph here, the x-axis is the level of conflict. So issues are quite varied, right? It could be a local community issue of a very, relatively small change that needs to happen, or something huge like climate change at a global level. And the reality is, as you expand in scope and more people are involved and more side issues come on, the conflict level increases. To have success, there's a relationship there. The greater the amount of conflict, the more effort you need to put into this campaign and the more support you need. So success is possible in a very high conflict issue, but you're going to need a lot of help and you're going to need to put a lot of energy in, whereas doing something small, might be much more achievable. So why do people do this here at all, ever? Well, the fact is, if you succeed here, your impact is huge. You're maybe affecting an entire province rather than an acre, somewhere in town. So it's not an easy decision. How big do we go? What's the success rate? What resources can we throw at this? Okay, so similar to structured decision making, when you're starting a campaign, the first piece that I'm going to talk about is the strategic planning phase, and then I'll talk about the action stuff. So when you're planning, it's still the same kind of principles. Frame the issue. What is this fundamentally about? You need to understand this yourself. Usually people come at it from, your personal view. Sage grouse, I care about them. It's about sage grouse because I don't want to go extinct. Well, there's more to it than that, right? There are, let's say, ranchers have their own view of things. Oil and gas has its own view of things, and so on. So the idea is that you need to step back and look at this from different perspectives and really understand what the basic conflicts are, and get a handle on what it's really about. You also need to spend some time clarifying your own objectives. Like, again, being crystal clear on what does success look like? What is it exactly that you want? Get that nailed down. And this can involve distinguishing means from ends. I mention this because it's an easy thing to get balled up in. Ends are the outcome. An end is the outcome you want. Means are the actions or approaches you use to achieve that outcome. Now, it seems straightforward enough, but in practice, you find that it sometimes can take, well, it can take years to get that ultimate end. And so you're working in stages on means, and sometimes they can take a life of your own. And you find, a year or two in that let's take an example of, we've said we're going to do public outreach. We're going to reach 10,000 people to, get something protected or other. And then, after a while, you can find yourself getting better and better at reaching people. And that has all of a sudden taken on a life of its own, and that's your objective. But you've kind of forgotten, you've taken your eyes off the ball. And the real issue is, have we achieved our protection of whatever it is that we want? So I just mentioned this because I have seen it happen in practice, that these things get mixed up along the way. And lastly, what are the competing objectives? Again, you're not out there by yourself. What are you can call them threats from your perspective. They're a threat. Somebody else might call it an end that they're after. But again, articulate and understand what the different forces are out there. Next part of the framing is understanding the scale. Sometimes this is a community issue. And other times it may be the municipality, maybe it's the province, maybe it's the entire country. So you got to figure that out. Again, it kind of seems simple, but in practice, it's not always. It can be that what you see locally is actually the symptom of a policy failure at a higher level. So if you attack something locally, you're basically treating a symptom and leaving the disease untouched, if you want to use that as an analogy. So again, it takes a little bit of thinking about, what am I seeing here locally? Is this truly a local issue, or do we have to look up higher and solve that through a policy change at a higher level? Next, some thought has to be given to decision making. The ultimate question you have is, who has the authority to make the change that you want? That person or that group is arguably the most important. All the other people you involve, they're all working together, to influence the decision that's getting made. So that person or that group is critical. Who is it? Is it the local town council? Is it the premier? That has to be sorted out early on. And how are if you have a specific decision that you want to have made, how is it going to be made? Is there a structured decision process in place? If not, where do we go? How do we do this? And then other decision-making questions are, put yourself in the shoes of the decision maker. Who is that decision-maker listening to? Does public opinion matter in this case? Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. It's actually more nuanced than you might think. What else is motivating decision makers? As an example, at a higher level, parties come in with platforms. They may have an ideology that guides their decision making in certain instances. So if you're working against that grain, you're going to have a very hard go at it. Whereas if you can somehow cast this as aligned with their direction, you're going along with the flow of the river, you're going to have a much easier time. So figuring all that out is important. And lastly, I put here, does a window of opportunity exist? I've got lots of gray hair, so I've seen how this changes over time. Sometimes things, and I'll give you an example at the end when I work through the case study. Sometimes it seems impossible. Doors are shut. And so you say, well, it's no point even trying. It can be that you just have to start the process and wait for the window of opportunity to arise, like a change of premier, a change of government. Things do change over time, and what might not work today might work tomorrow, and unfortunately, vice versa. As I talked to you about the land use framework. Next, moving on. If you're a lone voice, and even if you have a group, if your group is a lone voice, it's really hard. It'll work at a local level if local town council and you've got a lot of people behind you and so on. You can work, but as you get into broader scale, you better have some friends. That is very critical for success. So the strategic planning piece is, who are your potential friends? Who's going to ally with you, and how are you going to get them engaged? Because they're all busy. So you have to start thinking about where's the overlap in agendas, and how can we convince others to come along with us. I should say, in practice, it's very rare that you have a real formal sit together as a team, multiple allies working. It's more of loose alliances, people working together because there is some overlap in what they're doing. There's a bit of coordination, but it's very rarely, like I say, a really tight thing, and which is fine so long as you've got others that are working alongside you. The flip of that is, who are your opposing stakeholders? How much power do they have? Where does their power come from? Are there any ways around that? Those are kinds of strategic planning decisions that you have to make. Maybe there is a political champion. It might not be the premier, but maybe in a lot of cases at the department level, maybe there's somebody in Fish and Wildlife who's very keen to help you out and is going to, behind the scenes, maybe not overtly, going to help you out and say, this is who you have to talk to. This is the message that's going to resonate, so on, right? So you look for champions wherever they might be. And lastly, I've mentioned before, how much public support is there? Again, not every issue requires a ton of public support, but if it is one that is needed, you better be sure that you're aligned with public opinion. I mean, that has a life of its own, because a lot of times public isn't aware. The values might be there. In fact, the majority of Albertans have a strong environmental protection value. They want to see the environment protected, but they're busy people. They're carrying their kids off to soccer and so on, and they're overwhelmed by all the issues coming at them all the time. I know I am. So they may in theory support you, but they might not know what you're talking about, and trying to get their attention isn't easy. And Lord help you if you're working against the flow. If you're doing something that's really unpopular, it's going to be really tough to get public support, and in some cases that may be a stop for you right there. Getting to the end here is having a look at very carefully now these fundamental conflicts, the trade-offs, trying to understand why does this problem exist anyway? Because you might find, like one example, most of my experience has been in the north, and oil and gas has been a big issue there, right? Cumulative impacts of thousands and thousands of wells and seismic lines. A lot of what they do harms the environment, but it's not necessarily critical to what they do. For example, they had 8-meter seismic lines. Just because that was the size of the bulldozer, it was quite possible to get them to do, a 2-meter seismic line once they understood that it was a problem. So what I'm saying here about trade-offs is figuring out, why does this conflict exist? Maybe there are solutions that they just didn't know about because they didn't care. Nobody took them to task for it. They didn't care. So it's not necessarily always you're going to win or I'm going to win. It's a win or lose situation sometimes. And if you can find that route forward, a workable solution, again, your path forward is going to be so much better than forcing the public and government to make a hard choice. This group wins or that one, but I have to decide. Nobody likes making those tough decisions. Last step here is secure resources. Again, depends on the scale. If this is a local thing in your local town council, you and a few people as volunteers can get this done. But as you grow wider, the scale gets larger. It gets harder and harder, and you're going to, need more people involved for sure, and maybe some staff. These bigger campaigns, usually have one or two staff people assigned to them. Where does that money come from? You to pay them. You have to do that. And if you're starting to talk about communications in any large scale, that costs money. So you have to start thinking, if you're going to go in hard on this, where are you going to get the funding and the people, the human resources to make this happen? As I've mentioned, the longer it is and the broader the scope, the more resources you're going to need. So that kind of, I'm doing this very quick and broad brush, but gives you a basic sense, I hope, of some of the big strategic questions that are facing you when you say, am I going to start this campaign? And if so, what do I need to think about? So that's where you got to start. You've got to figure these things out. Next is taking action. And in most cases, when we're talking about environmental advocacy, we're talking about communication. We're talking about persuasive communication. We're trying to change minds. And so, again, I can't in this talk here go into any depth of this, but a few key ideas that you should think about are, first of all, the lead off is explaining to others what the problem is. As I said, people are busy, they're inundated with lots of problems. They don't probably even know what issue it is that you're talking about. Introduce it, and not only just say, sage grouse are disappearing. You have to find a way for your issue to explain it such that it resonates with people. You have to give them a reason to give a damn, right? They're busy. They're just because you say, I care about this and this is important to me, that's not good enough. If you're going to talk to other people, you have to, again, get in their shoes and figure out what it is that they might care about this issue and use that when you explain the problem to them. Go back to deep values. That often works. But you do have to think about that. It's not you. It's all of us together. And so they need a reason to care. As a general rule, simple, clear, and achievable. Those are three key words when it comes to drafting your proposal, your elevator pitch, whatever. You want to be clear, you want to be simple, and you want to have it achievable. That's going to get more traction than something really complicated, batches of figures and numbers and so on. You want something that people get right off the top. Another general principle is it's a lot more powerful to articulate an alternative vision than simply to dump on something that's happening, right? This is terrible. It shouldn't happen. You want to say what should happen. Build a positive message if you can in some ways, or at least a road forward kind of a message. Doesn't work for all issues, right? As you see with the coal, it wasn't possible. I'll have that as an example. I mean, it was a bad policy. We just wanted to rescind the policy. It's not really our alternative vision, but as a general rule, it's a good idea. Then you want to have sound arguments. It won't apply always. It won't depend to every audience that you'll need all the details and the facts and figures. But when it comes around to talking with specific stakeholders, getting allies and convincing folks, you better have your facts straight and your arguments in hand. You want a strong position. Why your solution is a good one. And at the same time, you should understand your opposition. What are the weaknesses in your arguments that they're going to attack? It's like a debate, right? What are the weaknesses in your argument that they're going to pick apart? Now strengthen those and look at theirs. Where are they soft? Where can you say, hey, this is not right what they're saying, or here's a solution to their problem, or this isn't even a problem. They're just making this stuff up, right? You look at both sides and make that persuasive set of arguments for the specific audiences that need the detail. And last but not least, is especially when you're engaging with the public, as you often are going to be, it's not so much the numbers per se, it's the emotional connection that makes the big difference. You put up a poster like this when you're talking about forestry or oil and gas, you've got people's attention. They don't want to see this bear lose last little bit of habitat. Uh, Sometimes that's all it needs. So visuals are critical, and most of the larger conservation groups know this, and that's not an accident. Wildlife Federation has a polar bear, right? Because that does. People love animals. They want to see nature succeed. And like I said, nobody's against nature. They just don't understand what's happening and what changes are needed. So we talked about allies, so you've identified them. Now you've got to convince them to join on. And I'll give you, it's really different depending on every campaign is unique in this respect. I'll give you a couple of examples, but this is where that comes important. And then the public outreach, if it's critical to this campaign, this is where you start to put it together. In the end, I like to think of this weigh scale, like government decision makers are sitting there. For them, status quo is the ideal. They don't want to do anything. They want to stick their neck in and not make trouble because there's no upside to that. So they like to go with status quo, but they're getting pounded from different sides, and they're starting to weigh the different positions. And ultimately, your job is to make sure that your side of the scale has the the different people that are talking about it, demanding change, not just you, outweigh the negatives. And there will be negatives, because you're going to see, as soon as you're successful, the opposite side is you're going to wake them up. This is a group of protesters at the legislature in Edmonton arguing against caribou protection. Why? Not because anybody was going to lose their jobs. It was potential that if you protected land in the future, someday we might not be able to have forestry there. There's no forestry there. But they're going to crawl out of the woodwork. And so you better be prepared for that, especially as you gain visibility and profile. At some point, not necessarily at the beginning, you will have to engage with the decision makers. As I said, ultimately, they are the focus of all of this. You want a decision made that will, achieve whatever change or outcome that you're after. So they need to understand what the issue is. They might not even be aware of it. Usually they are. Inform them and tell them what exactly it is that you are looking for. If you can, again, it's one of my favorite principles is get into their shoes and try to understand what life is like for them. They're battered from every side, right? People wanting everything. How can you present something that, if possible, provides them with a workable solution? If you just say, no, we got to shut down the oil sands, they can't do anything with that, because it's impossible politically for them. But if you can say, look, we can still have oil sands, but we're going to have 2-meter seismic lines instead of 8 meters. Yeah, geez, I could do that. Wonder what does Suncor say about that? So if you can get into their headspace and help them, you may find your path opened up for you. And lastly, make sure that you position yourself as a representative of a broader constituency. In many cases, the Engos in Alberta, they've got like 3 employees, 6, 8. These are not big organizations. They have a larger membership behind them. And that's what you're going to say, is that membership. And beyond that, it's the Albertans who care about the environment. You're that Lorax in the ring, but really you've got this team behind you of Albertans, who care and want something to change. So position yourself. That's where your power lies. It's as a representative. Now, as time goes on, each campaign will be different. I'm not going to go through all the variations. There's other steps depending on where you're at. Sometimes these can carry on. I'm going to give you an example. It took 20 years from start to finish. Patience is a part of this. You may need to wait for that window of opportunity to open. In the meantime, you want to be assessing what's working and what's not, and adjusting as you need to. So I'm just looking at the clock. I want to try to run through this quickly. I'm going to run through 2 campaigns. and they're quite different. And I'm not going to get into all the details, but I just wanted to show you how it works in practice. Understanding that every campaign is unique, but the principles. So when I was with CPAWS in the early 2000s, Special Places 2000, which was a protected area initiative, had just finished. Parks like Caribou Mountains here and Birch Mountains here had just been established, and the government said, "Yeah, we are great. We done," and they did do them. It was a good initiative, and the doors slammed shut. We're done. The protected area system in Alberta is finished, and we were sitting here in CPAW saying, "Well, wait a minute. There's this issue of the entire north is being transformed by industrial uses." It is such a busy landscape out there with oil and gas and roads and oil plants and forestry and agriculture in the Peace Country and so on. No, we're not done. The balance is not by a long shot achieved. So we refuse to take no for an answer and say, go home, you're done, protected area system is finished. We went and started a campaign against all odds. The issue, what is this about? The strategic analysis was rapid transformation of the boreal forest. And it turns out at that time, it was a topical issue across Canada, not just in Alberta. I won't go into the background, but it was a big deal here in Alberta. Other piece, most of the remaining intact forest in Alberta is in the northeast where we drew this line, right? We didn't just sort of pick a park. It was a strategy to pick a large chunk of land there, and I'll explain why. Again, here's Wood Buffalo Park to orient you. We saw this as an ecological anchor, is something to build around, okay? And if we did that, we collectively Albertans, it would be a world-class opportunity for conservation. We saw allies that were available. Sorry, we saw that there were allies available. I'll mention those in a minute. And we had a strategy that we could bring the resource sector on side, and that was called an offset strategy. The logic was pretty simple, and we borrowed this. Like none of this was made up by us. The oil sands, we took them as a fact of life. No conservation group in Alberta was going to stop them. It was like a third of the provincial budget was coming out at that time from that oil sand. But, we could characterize that as a big black hole in the ground. And so if we're going to dig that hole in the ground, we better offset the damage of the environmental damage with some world-class protection. And so the protection was in areas where the oil sands weren't, a similar forest, but we could get some of the oil sands companies to champion this, and especially Alpac, the forestry company there, to champion this. And that was critical. So I said we did the triad approach. We wanted to see this yellow line was the area that we said this should be protected area, this huge area. We said we want to connect these pieces up with Wood Buffalo Park. We want to buffer Wood Buffalo Park from all the oil sands going on down here. And we want to achieve natural region represent, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into details here. This area was picked for covering a lot of ground. Then we went and we were like 6, 8 people and eventually a couple staff. This is, CPAWS at the time was really tiny. CPAWS Northern Alberta, that is, the Edmonton group. So we got other provincial and national ENGOs, environmental groups on board. There was a group of Boreal researchers at the University of Alberta doing a whole bunch of research, and we're keen to share the results, and we're pivotal. I've mentioned Alpac, big forestry company just below that protected area I showed you. Again, I can't go into the details here, but they were trying to present themselves as green, and they became a champion of this initiative. CPAWS was not a market group. We didn't do boycotts and stuff, but there were a number of groups that did, and we invited them, if you will, in to raise the interest of forestry industry as in general in Alberta for change. We wanted to give them a reason why it's good to be green. There were some allies in government. We reached out to some indigenous groups, Mikisew Cree and Little Red, right in that very area there, which they're all downstream from the oil sands. So they were keen, and funding foundations to help with some of the financial stuff. Here is a map that shows you the access density. It's oil and gas. It's been everywhere here, and there's seismic lines and roads. It's not to scale, but it gives you the idea where the intact landscapes are left are in Wood Buffalo Park and in this region here. So this is the last stand of unprotected intact land. The Boreal researchers doing a ton of work, they helped make the case for why change is needed. The cumulative impacts of all those activity were having negative impacts on biodiversity. I contributed with a book that told the story of all these different people were doing things. It helped to pull it together. There was a public side. This is David Suzuki. We had a river trip down the Athabasca. That became a nature of things special, 1 hour thing, trying to raise the profile. The market groups were active, not in that area, but they were active in the east slopes. Again, getting industry a reason why change is needed, why status quo wasn't good enough, because they were getting hammered over their existing practices. In the end, again, this is all great, right? We're raising the profile. People are starting to become aware of the cumulative effects issue, the need for protection, but that doesn't protect land. The only entity in the province that can protect land is the government of Alberta. So ultimately, this needed to be funneled like a wedge into the government. The first step, the interim step, was this group called the Cumulative Environmental Management Association. It was a stakeholder group centered in Fort McMurray, largely funded from the oil sands companies. Basically there's like an octopus, many different arms, trying to figure out how can we do oil sands and not destroy the environment at the same time. Anyway, one of the subgroups was called a terrestrial management working group. And so they were trying to figure out this land use issue. And that's where these ideas of the triad were circulating, brought on, especially by ALPAC. And in the end of that process, it took several years, like I say, various stakeholders around the table, oil sands, forestry, indigenous, a couple of environmental groups, municipalities, and so on. This was a consensus kind of initiative, and the recommendation was to proceed with a triad approach in the whole region and to protect 20% of the land base. So this was a consensus group. Now, at the same time, remember I told you about the land use framework? It was happening at the same time. These were similar and they were related. Again, there's too much detail, but the point is that as the terrestrial group finished their report, the land use framework was wrapping up. And the first regional plan they did was the lower Athabasca, which wasn't exactly our Athabasca heartland, but the big key parts of it were in here. And so what ended up happening was the decision-making process on that regional plan, they just borrowed everything. It was a lot of the same people, just was transferred over from this terrestrial management group. And fast forward, it took another 10 years. But eventually, if you look on a map of protected areas of Alberta today, this is what it looks like. The dark green are the longer, older, existing protected areas, and all the light green are the areas that were established. They're official part of Alberta's park system today under the regional plan. So it was success. We had a big public input phase, certainly like the David Suzuki and all that stuff. Did the public really have a critical role? Arguably not. We never really reached the point where you could walk down the street and ask somebody, have you heard about the Athabasca Heartland, or do you know anything about it? No, people didn't know. We never reached to that level. But what we did do is the stakeholders and the players in the system of planning, the people who are involved in deciding what goes on in much of Northern Alberta, they knew. The Alberta Chamber of Resources was involved. Like I say, these forestry companies, CPAWs, we couldn't get anybody to answer a phone within the government, higher levels. Alpac probably played golf with them, I'm pretty sure, right? So by having a lot of different people playing different roles, it hit the political agenda. And a window of opportunity happened to arise, partially because they were pushed that direction, but partially because Ed Stelmach was a decent guy, and things happened. But it's never like there was thousands and thousands of people writing into the government that made this happen. So again, each area is unique. Each campaign is unique. Just finishing off quickly here, I want to contrast what I've just described to you, the Athabasca Heartland campaign, 20-year campaign from start to finish, with the coal policy. I suspect many of you are familiar with what happened there in 2020. Jason Kenney and the cabinet there decided that the Alberta coal policy, which restricted coal development in some of the more sensitive parts of the eastern slopes, not needed anymore. We've got good planning. This is the same person that just stopped the land use framework and all the planning. But okay, that was the idea. We don't need the coal policy. They rescinded it, and so the campaign started very quickly, and it was more of a reactive campaign then. The desired outcome was pretty simple: stop this proposal. It's wrong. That protection was playing an important role. In this case, again, there was no decision-making forum. This one day, Kenny just announced we've rescinded it. That was it. It was nobody knew that was coming. It just happened one day. So we're again in the public domain, like the wrestling match. There is no place to sit down and talk with stakeholders or anything like that. In this case, people came together sort of naturally. A lot of people, East Slopes are closer to the heart of a lot of people. The Boreal is far away and doesn't have as many champions, but East Slopes does. So a lot of people came together. Engos for sure. All of the Alberta Engos were immediately on board with doing something, pushing back against this. But there were some important allies. And again, it was never like all these allies sat around the table and compared notes and strategies and said, you do this. It was more of a loose alliance. What we had is local municipalities. They're worried about drinking water. They're worried about tourism, things like that. Local ranchers. There is a strong group of ranchers that really are interested in preserving the integrity of the land they grew up with in and around. So they raised a fuss. Certainly there were academics that weighed in about some of the risks and problems and so on. So it was a loose coalition of folks. And this fellow, I mean, arguably, this is Corb Lund, maybe the most important of all, because he was not like the Engos are, known, or whatever you do, we're going to kick back and say no to whatever government proposals. But you get somebody like Corb Lund, he was informed. Where you get his facts from was from the other people that were involved, but he doesn't have any political leanings, or he certainly doesn't say anything. But he was there to stand up for the environment, and he's got a following. And now you start. Remember that the scales, right? The two scales. You start to say, okay, I've got this big, huge Australian mining company and a few others, and now I'm getting more and more people. And this is where the public started to become important. Like I say, there was a message here that resonated deeply with Albertans, and people like Corb and all others started talking. The letters started flowing into the government. This is stupid. Stop this. Thousands of letters. So in this case, the public was key. And getting public on side, the story, create the story. It tells itself. Here's the foothills. Look at this. It's beautiful. This is our crown jewel. This is your vision, Mr. Kenny. This is what you want. He has no hope in hell once you start, doing those emotional outreach initiatives to get, because people, ultimately there are very few people employed here. There are a few, and they did fight, but ultimately the vast majority of people, they want this, and it's sold, and it worked. So I just want to say here that with all that support, the weigh scales finally tipped, and despite an intention to rescind the environmental policies, the UCP backed off, and they put that coal policy in. Where is it today? It's in limbo. They said there was going to be a land planning initiative. Nothing has ever come. I have no idea where it's going, but it has not happened. But the point is, the policy is back in place. With that, I wanted to leave time for questions, because my suspicion is there's a lot of questions around what I'm saying. I went pretty fast. I will say that if you are interested in more information on what you saw here today, I do have this conservation book. There's, like I say, a whole chapter on decision making. It really covers conservation. It's not a campaigning book, but it's about how to achieve conservation, taking the theory and applying it in real world situations. So if you're interested, you may find that useful. It's now an open text, so it's free. You just go to University of Alberta website I've got listed here, and you can just view on your computer. And then I've also I have a rough draft now, just posted this talk in written form, because I have a lot of photographs. You can't, if you want to refer back to anything, it's hard to make sense of what I just showed you. So if you go to this link, you'll find a written version of what I've just said today. So with that, I will stop, and I think we have a bit of time for a few questions at least. I think Steph has she has another meeting, so whoever wants to stay, I'm willing to stay, and whoever wants to or has to go, that's fine. You just do as you need.
Thank you so much, Rick. If everyone can put the clapping hands to show appreciation in your reaction there, I am going to stop the recording now, and then we'll take questions.